This is the Sales Babble Podcast, episode 396, a special announcement and a new beginning.
Welcome to Sales Babble, the podcast that shares selling secrets for non-sellers. And now your host, Pat Helmers.
Hello, Sales Babblers. This is Pat Helmers. And today I want to announce some big changes for the podcast. I know I've been speaking about this for the last month, but to be honest, I've been thinking about this for probably a year, maybe longer. What's been weighing heavy on my mind is that I've gotten stale when it comes to this podcast. I've been restless and wanting to do more. And if you've been following the podcast for a long time, you see that I've been putting a lot of energy into Habanero Media, helping people starting B2B podcasts. And most recently, I inaugurated the Cannabis Advocate podcast, just started in August, and it's a business podcast that advocates and promotes the cannabis industry. These new projects have been extremely enjoyable. They're new and exciting, and while Sales Babble has, for the most part, not changed in, and I'm not kidding, probably 7 years. Quite honestly, I've been considering stopping the podcast, or at least putting it on hold, with the idea that I might turn it into something that feels fresh and natural and authentic. When I began to have these thoughts, I socialized them with some friends of mine, and I had some people reach out to me and beg me to stop. They wanted to keep the podcast going. Quite frankly, I was surprised. It made me think, how can I keep it going and actually make the podcast something that I would enjoy working on? And then it occurred to me that maybe I have an opportunity here to take it in a direction that I've been wanting to do for a long time. Let me tell you some backstory. You may be surprised to learn that prior to starting the Sales Babble podcast, I'd actually written a blog called the Tao Te Ching of Sales. It was a blog that came out 3 times a week, and each post was a poem of sorts on selling, written in the form similar to the Tao Te Ching, an ancient book written 2,500 years ago by a guy named Lao Tze, which translated from Chinese to English is the old boy. I know, I just threw a bunch of terms at you, and I'm going to explain some of these terms in a bit. But to get back to the story, I did that blog for maybe 18 months, 3 times a week, and I really enjoyed it. But eventually I ran out of content, and I also came to the realization that what I'm talking about is really pretty arcane and wonky and nerdy, and it certainly isn't for everybody. Not that many people read the blog. Less and less people were reading blogs back in those days. I didn't necessarily care. I really found value in the process because it clarified in my mind what makes for great sales. And what's that? What makes for great sales? That's when the prospect decides on their own that buying makes sense for them. The seller is just merely a catalyst, a guide. That's how I sold software, and that's what I taught my staff. Non-pushy sales. And this is the kind of thing that you've been hearing on Sales Babble forever. It was from the Tao Te Ching of sales, Sales Babble was born. I've been an avid podcast listener for many, many, many years, but I couldn't find a podcast on selling that I really liked. Too many of them were all about tricks and traps and being pushy and arm twisting and kind of beating buyers into submission. Way too assertive, way too aggressive, things that I really couldn't relate to. Things that don't really work well in complex B2B sales. When you've got a room full of people with a whole bunch of different agendas, the key to success is to be kind and patient and tenacious. So because I couldn't find a podcast like that, that's why we started Sales Babble. Now, why am I telling you all this history? Because it frames the course of action for the next chapter of Sales Babble. I mentioned the Tao Te Ching. About 30 years ago, I read an article that I've posted on my wall. In fact, I'm holding it right now. It's moved from office to office over the years. I still got it. And it still looks pretty good. And it contained 2 profound quotes on it. Quote, "A leader is best when people barely know he exists." And the second quote was, "When all is done, the people say, 'We did it.'" As a new manager, I was a technical manager back then, these quotes really created possibility for the kind of boss that I always wanted to work for and I always wanted to be. Over time, I learned that these ideas were attributed to a guy named Lao Tze, who I'd mentioned before, and he authored the Tao Te Ching. If we were to translate it into English, it means the way. With a little bit of digging, I found the original quote, and this is how it's translated in English by Stephen Mitchell. Quote, "When the master governs, the people are hardly aware that he exists. Next best is a leader who is loved. Next, one who is feared. The worst is one who is despised. If you don't trust the people, you make them untrustworthy. The master doesn't talk, he acts. When his work is done, the people say, 'Amazing, we did it, all by ourselves.'" Can you see how this applies to sales? Picture someone buying your product and you ask them about it and they say, "Amazing, we did it all by ourselves." In this case, they barely even know that the seller was there. That's non-pushy sales, right? What Lao Tze has observed was the way that most humans behave, and how they act is actually counterproductive. Salespeople want to make something happen. They take action, and in many cases, they actually get the opposite of what they desired. We've all experienced this, right? Even been guilty, probably, right? And it's understandable. This is true of all people. You want your kids to do one thing and they do another. You want someone to respect you, and yet they dislike you. You try to bang out a project in too little time and on the cheap, and it gets finished half-baked and half-ass. We're always trying to take control of the world and the people around us and wrestle them into place, but that doesn't work. It's frustrating and full of anxiety. Lao Tze takes a different view. He instead believes that there's a natural way for things to work. He came to this understanding by looking at nature and its simplicity and how the seasons work, how a seed with a little bit of sun and water could grow to be a great and mighty oak, a tree that grows acorns that fall to the ground, only to repeat the cycle. No one's planting it. No one's nurturing it. On its own, with no effort, great forests are grown that feed and shelter vast communities of birds and animals and the oxygen for us to breathe. But that's not what most people do, is it? They get impatient and they think, there's got to be a better way of doing this. Faster, cheaper, better. We see this in business and governments all the time, where they set up these heavy-handed rules and regulations that are adorned with values and ethics and laws, which don't work in every case and goes against common sense and nature. And all it does is alienate people to go against the natural course of the world. Lao Tze called this natural course the Tao, and it's spelled T-A-O, but it's pronounced Tao with a D. And in English, I like to translate it as the way, or maybe the way things are, or maybe how things work in the world. It's all the same idea. Like I said, people want control. They think society and science can regulate all this control. But to quote Willie Nelson, we are not in control. Thank goodness. In many ways, the Tao is the antithesis, the opposite of Western philosophy, where we name and categorize, distinguish and discern the world into parts that are assembled into a greater whole. And for complex things, parts fit in parts, fit in parts, fit in parts. And when it's fully assembled, we often don't know what we've got. Like a good example is that's our economy or the weather. People don't fully understand it, even though we've broken it down into little atomic pieces. And don't get me wrong, this has worked really great in some cases. Like we wouldn't have modern medicine without a taxonomy approach of modern Western science. It has its place, but we can't completely understand the universe with this approach. It's not the final definition. There are elements of it missing. And as you hear this, I'm probably not telling you something that you don't already know. You know that there's limits to what we can know, and that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So it begs the question, what should we do? If there are limits to our ability to control outcomes and results, what's the answer? The Taoists recommend we'd all be better off to do nothing. Let's let this thought bounce around in our brains for a moment and let it settle. Do nothing. The Chinese word for that is Wu Wei, non-doing. Now this may sound goofy, but you've experienced this. Think of it in terms of a flow state or being in the zone, where you're playing a sport and you're so into it, you're not really making decisions. The play just happens. You're no longer a player in the sport, but you are the sport. Like when you're driving a car, you're not making decisions to turn on this street or stop at this intersection. It just happens. Non-doing. Like when you're gaming, you're finding resistance, but overcoming. It's not too hard. It's not too easy. It just happens. That's non-doing. Consider the times in our lives where you've had these big set of problems, and there's a lot of anxiety with what to do, but then something happens, and it's no longer an issue. Through no effort of your own, the problems have been fixed, or maybe more properly, it's no longer a problem. It's like when you find a lost to-do list like a week later, and there's a bunch of unscratched items on it, and you look at them, and they're no longer relevant. They happened on their own, or they don't need to be done anymore. How many times have you had a deal not close, despite the fact that you busted your butt trying to get it over the finish line? Meanwhile, other deals just close with hardly any effort at all. What's up with that? That's Wu Wei. So what's this got to do with the podcast? This is the thing. I'm experiencing Wu Wei right now, at this very moment. Wasn't sure what to do with Sales Babble, but then all of a sudden, a solution appeared. And that's the Tao Te Ching of sales. For the next 6 months, I'm going to share my blog, but supplement it with stories and tales. Each episode is going to focus on one practical nugget of sales advice with an example. These episodes are going to be short and sweet. Each episode will have show notes and transcriptions, and when all is said and done, it will be assembled into a book that I've been wanting to write for years. In detail, each episode is going to be a chapter in the book. It will start with the poem that's only 10 to 15 lines. It's then followed by a story, and there's going to be 3 characters in these stories: Chris, Lee, and Pat. Pat's the master seller sales manager and the sage Lao Tze. Chris is the young and enthusiastic new sales professional, and Lee is the customer, and the customer is always right. These episodes are only going to be like 5 to 6 minutes long, quite a bit shorter than what you've been used to listening to Sales Babble. Let me give you an example. The podcast will sound something like this. This chapter is called Listening. Quote, "The master seller listens before talking, sells without effort, sharing without preaching, explaining without judging, demonstrating without closing, never assuming the sale, the master never loses one." And that's the chapter. Now the story. After Chris scheduled the sales presentation, they whooped for joy in the office. Chris had fully qualified the prospect and absolutely knew they were going to buy. There was zero doubt. "1 second," said Pat, after being startled by the joyful shout. "Let's not count our chickens until they're hatched. There are many reasons the prospect won't be ready to buy. Take your time and don't assume it's a done deal. Share what we do, how we help, and don't forget to fully ask why they've agreed to meet with you. Listen. Listen with intent to their answers. If you do that, you will know how you can help, and you will know what to say." That's the story. That's the advice. And sometimes I might circle back to the poem. Like in this example, it says, quote, "Never assuming the sale, the master never loses one." This is the thing. Slow down your selling. Take your time. Don't make any assumptions. And with patience and tenacity, you'll be closing deals. And that would be the podcast episode. This is what you can expect. What do you think? Can you see how this could be a cool bedside book? Read one little chapter before you go to sleep and let it simmer all night. You can help me write it. You can give me feedback on these chapters and stories. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you're not yet subscribed to Sales Babble, you can do so on your podcast app. Do it now and you'll never miss an episode. Again, they'll be coming out every Tuesday morning, 3 a.m. Central. That's -5 UTC. That's all I've got for this week, folks. I'm really looking forward to bringing you along on this adventure. It's going to be fun. It's going to be interesting. It's going to be different. And it's not going to be Sales Babble as you have known it in the past. To be honest, I may throw a few interviews in here and there. Certainly going to do the top 10 with Neil over Christmas. Can't miss that. Can't skip that one. That's all I've got for this week, folks. Until next week, take care and have a highly successful and a profitable selling day.
Thank you for listening to the Sales Babble podcast. Find us at www.salesbabble.com.
This is a production of Habanero Media.